The orchard keeper's decision. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the land in soft gold. James Whitmore sat on the edge of his creaking wooden bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he listened to the familiar sounds of his old farmhouse settling around him. The quilt his late mother had sewn decades ago pooled at his feet as he took a deep breath, feeling the quiet weight of another day on his shoulders. Outside, the wind carried the scent of apples, faint, but always present. The orchard had been his father's, and his father's before him. It was his inheritance, his burden, and his sanctuary all at once. Whitmore orchards had survived droughts, floods, and neglect. But now, the trees were dying, and with them, so was everything James had left. As he moved through his morning routine, feeding the barn cats and making coffee that was far too bitter, his mind was already on the long list of tasks ahead. He needed to check the irrigation system, clear out the dead branches, and somehow figure out how to keep the bank from taking his land. He didn't need any distractions, but distractions had a way of finding him anyway. By mid-morning, James was in town, standing in line at Russell's Hardware, with a bag of fertilizer in one hand and a set of pruning shears in the other. The store smelled of sawdust and motor oil, the way it always had since he was a boy. He half listened to the country music playing on the radio, letting the quiet hum of conversation around him fade into the background, until something caught his ear. "Such a shame about Cassie," a woman said, her voice tinged with concern. James turned slightly, recognizing Ellen Carter, the town's social worker. She was speaking in hushed tones to Nancy, the clerk, whose expression was full of pity. 23 homes, Ellen said, shaking her head. That girl has been in 23 different placements. None of them stuck. Maybe she's just not the kind of kid you can help, Nancy muttered. James frowned, shifting his grip on the pruning shears. What do you mean? He asked before he could stop himself. Both women startled, clearly unaware anyone had been listening. Ellen recovered first, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Cassie Monroe. She's been in foster care most of her life. 13 years old, but acts like she's grown. Doesn't trust anyone, fights authority, and runs first chance she gets. She's been through more homes than I can count. Some kids just can't be saved, Nancy added, shaking her head. James's jaw tightened. She's just a kid. Ellen sighed. I know, but no one wants to take her in anymore. She's too much trouble, they say. If no one steps up soon, she'll end up in a state facility. And those places. She trailed off, her expression grim. James felt something twist in his chest. He knew what state facilities were like. Underfunded, overcrowded, and cold. Kids went in angry and came out worse. Nobody's taking her, he asked, his voice rough. Ellen hesitated, then shook her head. Nobody. James stood there for a long moment, staring down at the shears in his hand. He had enough problems of his own. The orchard, the bank, the bills he couldn't pay. He didn't have room in his life for a kid with a history of running. But there was a part of him that couldn't shake the thought of a child, 13 years old, already convinced she had nowhere left to belong. That night, James barely slept. The conversation in the hardware store played in his mind like a broken record. Nobody's taking her. At 6:00 a.m., before the sun had fully risen, he picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the buttons, his heart pounding with a weight he hadn't felt in years. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he dialed. Child Services. This is Ellen Carter speaking. James took a breath. It's James Whitmore. I want to talk about that girl, Cassie Monroe. There was silence on the other end. When Ellen finally spoke, her voice was careful. Mr. Whitmore, this isn't an easy case. Cassie isn't looking for a family. She's spent too long convincing herself she doesn't need one. She'll test you. She'll fight you. And if she runs, she won't come back. James set his jaw. What do I have to do? The paperwork was endless. Background checks, home visits, interviews. Every step felt like a test, as if the universe itself was trying to see if he was really serious. Ellen watched him the entire time, waiting for the moment he would back out. But he never did. 2 weeks later, a state car rolled up the long dirt driveway, kicking up dust as it stopped in front of the farmhouse. James stood on the porch, arms crossed. His heart thumped in his chest as the back door of the car opened, and out stepped Cassie Monroe. She was smaller than he expected, swallowed by an oversized hoodie that hung off her like a shield. Her dark eyes darted around, scanning everything, mapping exits, calculating escape routes. She clutched a beat-up duffel bag so tightly her knuckles were white. Ellen stepped out of the driver's seat, her expression unreadable. "Cassie, this is James Whitmore. James, this is Cassie." Cassie barely glanced at him before shifting her weight, clearly ready to bolt at any second. James took a slow breath. He'd worked with spooked horses before, and she had the same look in her eyes, wild, restless, and ready to run. "James is fine," he said, keeping his voice steady. Cassie didn't respond. She just gripped her bag tighter. Ellen sighed. "Cassie, do you want to come inside?" Cassie hesitated for a moment, then gave a small, barely noticeable nod. James stepped back, leaving the door open. "Suit yourself." She walked in, her shoulders tense, and as the screen door creaked shut behind her, James had a sinking feeling that he had just let a storm into his home. She didn't speak much that first day. At dinner, she shoveled food into her mouth as if she expected someone to take it away. Later, when James walked through the kitchen, he saw her stuffing granola bars into her duffel bag. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorway and said quietly, "Nobody's taking that from you, kid." Cassie flinched, her hands freezing mid-motion, but she didn't put the food back. James let her be. That night, he lay awake in bed, listening to the creaks of the old farmhouse and the sound of soft footsteps pacing in the room down the hall. Cassie Monroe was planning her escape, and James Whitmore was already preparing for the fight to make her stay. The storm within. The early morning mist clung to the apple trees as James stepped onto the porch, steaming coffee mug in hand. The orchard stretched before him, rows of trees standing like soldiers in the soft light of dawn. The air smelled damp, rich with the promise of rain. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle into his chest. Inside the house, the sound of soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. Cassie was awake. James had spent years waking up to the quiet, to the predictable rhythm of life on the orchard. But now, there was another presence in the house, a restless energy that hadn't been there before. He had half expected to find her bed empty this morning, the duffel bag gone, and the front door swinging open in her wake. But when he checked, the door was still locked, and the faint sound of movement from her room told him she was still here. For now. The screen door creaked open, and Cassie stepped outside, her oversized hoodie pulled tightly over her head. She hesitated for a moment, looking around as if she wasn't sure whether to sit or run. James nodded toward the porch steps. "You hungry?" She shook her head, her dark eyes darting toward the dirt road leading away from the house. "You sleep?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Another shake of the head. James sighed, setting his mug down on the railing. "You planning on talking anytime soon?" Cassie just shrugged, her fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. They sat in silence for a while, the air thick with unspoken words. James had never been much for conversation. He preferred the quiet work of the orchard, the patience it required. But Cassie, she wasn't just quiet. She was guarded, like a wild animal waiting for a trap to spring. Finally, she broke the silence. "You got rules." James turned to look at her, surprised she had spoken first. "Rules," he repeated. She nodded. "Everywhere I go, there's rules. No running, no stealing, no talking back, no fighting." She shifted slightly. "They always say them first thing." James leaned against the railing, considering her words. "How'd that work out for them?" he asked. Cassie's lips twitched into something that almost resembled a smirk. "Not great." James rubbed his jaw. "Well, I got 2 rules," he said finally. 1. Don't lie to me. 2. If you run, don't expect me to come chasing after you. Cassie's smirk faded. She looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You wouldn't." James took another sip of his coffee. "You're not a prisoner here, kid. Door's right there. You want to leave, leave. But if you stay, you work." Cassie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what kind of game he was playing. Finally, she shrugged. "Fine." James didn't push her for more. He simply stood, stretched his aching back, and walked down toward the orchard, leaving her to sit with her own thoughts. She didn't move for a long time. The day passed in slow, heavy silence. James spent most of it tending to the trees, clearing away the weak branches and inspecting the soil. The orchard was in bad shape, but he wasn't ready to give up on it just yet. Cassie stayed inside, moving through the house like a ghost. At lunchtime, James found her in the kitchen, standing by the fridge with her duffel bag unzipped on the floor. He didn't need to ask what she was doing. He already knew. "Still stockpiling food?" he asked, leaning against the counter. Cassie flinched, then quickly covered it by rolling her eyes. "Not stockpiling," she muttered. James crossed his arms. "If you want food, just take it. You don't have to sneak." Cassie huffed, stuffing a granola bar into her pocket. Old habits. James studied her, noting the way her shoulders were tensed, like she was bracing for a fight. But he didn't give her one. He just turned, grabbed an apple from the counter, and took a bite. "Storm's coming," he said instead. Cassie frowned, glancing out the window. "What?" James nodded toward the sky, where thick clouds were starting to gather on the horizon. "Storm. Gonna be a bad one." Cassie shifted, uncomfortable. So, James said, finishing his apple. "Storms mess with the orchard. Might need an extra set of hands." Cassie snorted. "I don't work for free." James shrugged. "Good thing I wasn't planning to pay you." Cassie frowned, clearly not expecting that answer. She looked down at her duffel bag, fingers tightening around the straps. Then, to James's surprise, she sighed and dropped it onto the floor. "Fine," she muttered. "What do I have to do?" James smirked. "Come on, city kid. Let's see if you can handle a little dirt." The wind picked up by late afternoon, rustling through the orchard like a warning. James worked quickly, securing the protective covers over the saplings and checking the branches for any weak spots. Cassie trailed behind him, grumbling the whole way. "This is stupid," she muttered as she helped tie down the coverings. "Trees can handle a little rain." James chuckled. "You ever seen an apple tree after a bad storm?" Cassie shrugged. "No." "Well, you're about to learn." By the time the first drops of rain started to fall, the orchard was as secure as it was going to get. James wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing at Cassie, who was standing under one of the bigger trees, her hood pulled up, arms crossed. She looked out at the orchard, frowning. "Why do you even bother?" she asked suddenly. James glanced at her. "Bother with what?" She gestured at the trees. "This. It's all dying. You're just delaying the inevitable." James was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped forward, pressing a hand against the trunk of one of the trees. "You ever see a tree come back to life?" he asked. Cassie scoffed. "Trees don't come back to life." James smiled faintly. "Some do. You just gotta know which ones are worth saving." Cassie stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she muttered something under her breath and stomped back toward the house, leaving muddy footprints in her wake. James watched her go, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Maybe, just maybe, this kid was one of the trees worth saving. That night, as the storm raged outside, James lay awake listening to the rain pounding against the roof. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the windows. Down the hall, Cassie's door remained unlocked. James didn't say anything about it the next morning, but as they sat at the kitchen table, eating breakfast in silence, he noticed something different. Cassie wasn't watching the exits anymore. She was watching him. The first cut. The storm had passed, leaving the orchard soaked and the air thick with the scent of damp earth and bruised apples. The sky was a heavy gray, with the sun barely peeking through the clouds, as if it were hesitant to shine just yet. James stood on the porch, one hand resting on the wooden railing, the other gripping his coffee mug. Cassie was out there somewhere. She had disappeared into the trees at first light, slipping out before breakfast. He hadn't stopped her. She needed space, and James knew better than to chase after someone who wasn't ready to be caught. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. She'd be back. She had nowhere else to go. By mid-morning, James found her in the orchard. She was crouched near one of the younger trees, her hoodie damp from the lingering rain, her fingers tracing the bark like she was trying to feel for something unseen. She didn't turn when he approached, just kept running her hand along the trunk. "You lost?" James asked, stopping a few feet away. Cassie didn't look up. "The storm messed them up," she said flatly, nodding toward the broken branches littering the ground. Some still clung to the trees, heavy with soaked leaves and fruit, weighed down by the weight of the storm. James took a slow breath. "Yeah," he said, scanning the damage. "Storms do that." Cassie finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "So what do we do?" James studied her, considering his answer. He could see it now. She wasn't asking about the trees. Not really. He crouched beside her, pulling a pruning knife from his back pocket. "We cut away the dead parts," he said simply. Cassie frowned, glancing at the knife in his hand. "What if it's not completely dead?" James ran his fingers over a branch that had cracked during the storm. The leaves were still green, but the damage was too deep. It wouldn't survive much longer. "Doesn't matter," he said, lifting the blade and making a clean cut just above the break. The branch fell to the ground with a quiet thud. "If it's too damaged, it just takes energy from the rest of the tree. Gotta let it go so the rest can grow." Cassie swallowed hard, looking down at the broken branch. "You ever done this before?" she asked after a moment. James shook his head. "Nope." Cassie's eyebrows furrowed. "What? But, I mean with people." Cassie's mouth snapped shut. They sat there in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, James held the pruning knife out to her. "Your turn," he said. Cassie hesitated. "What if I cut the wrong thing?" James smirked. "Then we plant another one." Cassie rolled her eyes but took the knife. She turned back to the tree, her fingers tightening around the handle. She lifted it, pressed the blade against a weak branch, and hesitated. James watched as she exhaled slowly, then made the cut. The branch dropped to the ground. Cassie stared at it, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths. James nodded. "Good cut." Cassie wiped her hands on her jeans, then stood. "Whatever," she muttered, but her voice lacked its usual bite. James chuckled. "Come on. There's plenty more where that came from." The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm. James worked alongside Cassie, moving through the orchard, cutting away what needed to go, making space for what could still grow. Cassie didn't talk much, but James didn't mind. He could feel something shifting, something settling between them like roots taking hold in the soil. By sunset, they had cleared 2 rows of trees. James straightened, stretching his sore back, and glanced at Cassie. She was leaning against one of the stronger trees, her arms crossed, her hoodie still damp from the morning rain. He tilted his head toward the house. "Dinner." Cassie hesitated, then nodded. James didn't say anything, just started walking. She followed, and for the first time, she didn't keep checking over her shoulder. That night, James sat at the kitchen table, an old ledger open in front of him. The numbers weren't good. The orchard was struggling. He ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Across from him, Cassie sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, a granola bar in one hand, flipping through an old book about farming that she'd found on the shelf. James glanced up at her. "You ever read anything that's not about running or stealing?" Cassie shrugged. "Not really." James smirked. "Figures." They sat in silence for a while. Then Cassie set the book down, her fingers tracing the edge of the cover. "Do they always come back?" she asked quietly. James frowned. "Who?" Cassie looked out the window, into the orchard. "The trees, after you cut the bad parts off." James followed her gaze. The trees stood in the moonlight, silent and steady. "Most of them," he said. "Some don't. But the ones that do, they're stronger for it." Cassie nodded slowly. James let the words hang between them. A few minutes later, she yawned, rubbing her eyes. "I'm going to bed," she mumbled, standing up. James watched as she hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. For the past week, every night, he had heard the quiet click of her locking her door. Tonight, as she disappeared down the hall, the click never came. James smiled to himself. One cut at a time. The weight of roots. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp soil and apples ripening under the first hints of autumn. James stood in the orchard, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground as he leaned against an old apple tree, surveying the land. The storm had passed, but its damage lingered. Some of the weaker trees had suffered broken branches, while others had held strong, their roots deep and unshaken. It was always a test, watching which ones bent under pressure and which ones snapped. Cassie was at the far end of the orchard, hoodie pulled up, hands stuffed into her pockets, kicking at fallen leaves as she walked aimlessly between the trees. James let her be. She wasn't running, not yet. That was enough. For now, a different kind of fight. By midday, James was back at the farmhouse, sorting through the mess of bills spread across the kitchen table. His eyes skimmed over the overdue notices, the reminders from the bank, the numbers that never seemed to add up. The orchard wasn't making enough. And if things didn't turn around soon, he was going to lose it. A sharp knock on the front door pulled him from his thoughts. He frowned, setting the papers aside, and made his way to the entrance. When he opened the door, Ellen Carter, the town social worker, stood on the porch, clipboard in hand. James exhaled through his nose. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Ellen offered a tight smile, shifting the clipboard against her chest. "Can I come in?" James stepped aside, letting her enter. She glanced around the farmhouse, taking in the worn wooden floors, the sturdy furniture, the quiet sense of history that filled the place. Cassie wasn't in sight, but James knew she was nearby, listening. "I wanted to check in," Ellen said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. "Cassie's been here a little over a month now. That's already longer than most places she's stayed." James crossed his arms. "She's still here." Ellen nodded. "That's a good sign. But I need to ask, how's she doing?" James sighed, rubbing his jaw. "She's stubborn. Keeps her guard up. Doesn't talk much, but she works hard." He glanced toward the window, where he could see the orchard stretching out into the distance. "She's got a good eye for the trees." Ellen smiled faintly. She always was smart, just never had a place to put that energy. James leaned against the counter. "And now?" Ellen hesitated. "James, you know Cassie's mother is still in the system, right?" His body went still. "What do you mean?" Ellen folded her hands on the table. "Sarah Monroe has been in rehab. She's been clean for over a year now, has steady employment, and she's petitioning for visitation." James clenched his jaw. "And if she wants more than that?" Ellen sighed. "If she proves stability, she can file for full custody." Silence filled the kitchen, thick and unmoving. James had always known this was a possibility. Kids in the system didn't just disappear. Parents, even the worst ones, had legal rights. But hearing it, knowing that Cassie's past was coming back for her, made his gut tighten. Cassie doesn't know yet, Ellen continued. I wanted to talk to you first. I don't know how she'll react, but I need you to be ready. James nodded slowly, his mind already racing ahead. Is Sarah fit to take her back? He asked, his voice rough. Ellen hesitated. She's done everything the courts asked of her. That doesn't mean she's ready. But if Cassie wants to see her, we have to let her. James rubbed his forehead. And if she doesn't? Ellen exhaled. Then it'll be up to the courts. The front door creaked slightly. James looked up just in time to see Cassie slipping out onto the porch, her body tense, her hands clenched into fists. She had heard, and she was already preparing to run. Breaking points. James didn't follow her immediately. He knew better than that. Instead, he finished his conversation with Ellen, made her promise to keep him updated, and saw her out. Then he went outside. Cassie sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the dirt road leading away from the house. James sat beside her, his boots scuffing against the wood. You heard. Cassie nodded stiffly. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, she always does this. Her voice was flat, but there was something dangerous simmering beneath it. She gets clean. She promises things will be different, and then she screws it all up. James kept his gaze on the orchard. What do you want to do? Cassie let out a bitter laugh. Like I have a choice. You always have a choice, kid. Cassie turned to him then, her dark eyes filled with something sharp and broken. No, I don't. Her voice wavered. I didn't get to choose any of it. Not when she left. Not when they took me away. Not when they shoved me into house after house full of people who didn't want me. James clenched his jaw. I want you. Cassie flinched, her breath catching. For a long time, she didn't say anything. She just stared at him, like she was waiting for him to take it back. He didn't. Finally, she whispered, You don't even know me. James exhaled. Yeah, I do. Cassie shook her head, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. She's going to take me back. James's chest tightened. Not if you don't want to go. Cassie swallowed hard. I don't know. She looked away, her fingers gripping the fabric of her hoodie like it was the only thing keeping her together. James sat with her, letting the weight of her uncertainty settle between them. Finally, he said, You don't have to decide today. Cassie sniffed, nodding slightly. They sat in silence, the wind rustling through the trees. Then, softly, James said, You know how you asked me if trees always come back after we cut the bad parts away. Cassie nodded, her chin still resting on her knees. Sometimes, James said, but it takes time. And sometimes, you gotta help them a little. Cassie let out a shaky breath. I don't know how. James reached out, ruffling her hair gently. That's why I'm here. Cassie didn't pull away. And for the first time, she didn't look like she wanted to run. That night, Cassie left her bedroom door open. James noticed. He didn't say anything. But he slept a little easier. The sky had deepened into shades of orange and violet as the sun set behind the orchard, casting long shadows across the land. The farmhouse was quiet, but tension sat heavy in the air, thick like the humidity before a storm. Cassie hadn't spoken much since the conversation with Ellen. She had spent most of the afternoon in the barn loft, where she often went when she needed space. James had let her be. He knew that sometimes silence was the only thing a person had to hold on to. But now, as he stood at the stove stirring a pot of stew, he could hear the faint creak of footsteps coming down the stairs. She was coming to dinner. That was something. James kept his movements slow and steady, not wanting to startle her. Dinner's almost done, he said casually. Cassie hovered in the doorway, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands, watching him with that wary expression she always wore when she felt cornered. James ladled the stew into 2 bowls, setting one down in front of her usual chair. Then, without looking at her, he grabbed a loaf of bread from the counter. tore off a piece, and set it next to her bowl. "Sit," he said. She hesitated, then moved stiffly to the chair and sat. She didn't reach for the food right away, just stared at the bowl, as if trying to decide whether or not she should eat. James took his own seat and started eating. For a few minutes, the only sound was the quiet scrape of spoons against ceramic. Then, Cassie finally spoke. "So, what happens if she wins?" James set his spoon down. He had been expecting this question. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together before answering. "The courts will decide," he said carefully, "but that doesn't mean you don't get a say." Cassie clenched her jaw. "Doesn't feel like it." James studied her, noticing the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table. "You scared?" he asked. Cassie scowled. "No." James smirked slightly. "Liar." Cassie glared at him, but didn't argue. James sighed, pushing his bowl aside. "Look, kid, I don't know what's gonna happen. But I do know one thing. You're not the same girl you were when you got here." Cassie scoffed. "What's that supposed to mean?" James gestured toward the window, where the orchard stood in the fading light. "You're not looking for the nearest exit anymore." Cassie frowned. "So what?" "So," James said, "it means you've got roots now, and that means you've got something to fight for." Cassie swallowed hard, looking away. "I don't even know if I want to fight." James nodded slowly. "That's fair." He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "But let me tell you something, kid. Fighting doesn't always mean running. Sometimes it just means standing your ground." Cassie was silent for a long time, staring at the stew like it held all the answers she didn't have. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she whispered, "She's gonna promise things will be different." James nodded. "Probably. She's gonna say she's changed." "She might have." Cassie looked up at him then, her dark eyes searching his. "But you don't think she has?" James exhaled. "I think people can change. But I also think they have to prove it." Cassie let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can trust her again." James met her gaze. "Then don't." Cassie blinked. "What?" James leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Trust isn't given, kid. It's earned. And if she wants you back in her life, she's got to earn it." Cassie frowned. "And what if she can't?" James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then you get to decide what family means to you." Cassie stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked down at her hands, her nails digging into her sleeves. Finally, she reached for her spoon and took a slow bite of stew. She didn't say anything else. But James knew that meant she was thinking about it. Midnight confessions. The farmhouse was silent that night. James sat in his armchair, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't rest. Upstairs, Cassie's light was still on. She hadn't locked her door. She hadn't slammed it shut. But she hadn't come down either. James ran a hand over his face, sighing heavily. Then, just as he was about to get up and turn in for the night, he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Cassie appeared in the doorway, her hoodie pulled up, hands buried in the sleeves. She hovered there for a moment before stepping inside. James raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind?" Cassie hesitated, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Then she said, "I don't remember what her voice sounds like." James blinked. Cassie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the floor, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie. "I try," she whispered. "I try to remember how she used to sound. But it's all fuzzy now. Like a dream I can't hold on to." James felt something in his chest tighten. He set his coffee aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That bother you?" Cassie shrugged. "I don't know." She exhaled sharply. "Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it means she was never really there to begin with." James didn't say anything. Cassie looked up at him then, her expression raw and vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. Do you think she actually wants me? Or do you think she just doesn't want to feel guilty anymore? James exhaled. I don't know, kid, but I do know this. What she wants doesn't matter as much as what you want. Cassie chewed on her bottom lip. And what if I don't know what I want? James smirked slightly. Then we figure it out. Cassie scoffed. That easy, huh? James shrugged. Nothing about this is easy, but I've found that most things worth keeping aren't. Cassie was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, she sighed and flopped onto the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. James leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle between them. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Cassie didn't go back upstairs, and James didn't send her. Some conversations weren't meant to be rushed. Some wounds took time to heal, and some trees, no matter how many times they'd been battered by storms, just needed the right kind of soil to grow again. The choice ahead. The next morning, James found Cassie standing in the orchard, her hands stuffed in her hoodie pockets, her face unreadable. He approached her slowly, giving her space. You sleep? He asked. Cassie shrugged. Not really. James nodded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Cassie let out a slow breath. You really think I have a say in this? James met her gaze. I do. Cassie swallowed hard. Then, after a moment, she whispered, Okay. James exhaled. Okay. Cassie nodded. She still didn't know what her decision would be. But for the first time, she was willing to think about it. And that was enough. For now. The ties that bind. The crisp autumn air settled over Whitmore orchards, filling the morning with the scent of damp earth and ripening apples. The storm had passed days ago, but the orchard still bore its scars. Branches broken, leaves scattered, the remnants of the wind's fury scattered like forgotten promises. James stood at the edge of the field, hands resting on his hips, surveying the damage. It would take weeks to clean up, and even longer for the weaker trees to recover. Some might not survive at all. He glanced over his shoulder toward the house. Cassie was standing on the porch, hoodie pulled over her head, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had been distant since Ellen's visit, her usual defiance dampened by something heavier. James knew the look. It was the face of someone bracing for loss. She had worn it the day she arrived, and she was wearing it again now. A name from the past. James was fixing a section of fencing when Cassie appeared beside him, her hands stuffed deep in her hoodie pockets. She didn't say anything at first, just scuffed her foot against the dirt. Finally, she muttered, When do I have to see her? James paused, setting down his tools. She asked for a meeting, he admitted. Ellen said we could set something up in town. Neutral ground. Cassie's jaw clenched. And if I don't go? James exhaled. That's your choice, kid. Cassie scoffed. Right, because I have so many of those. James wiped his hands on a rag, watching her carefully. You do now. Cassie flinched slightly, like she wasn't sure whether to believe him. She left before, she said quietly. She always leaves. James nodded. I know. Cassie kicked at the dirt. She says she's clean. She does. Cassie frowned. You believe her? James thought about that for a long moment. I think people can change, he said finally. But I also think you don't owe her trust just because she says the right words. Cassie stared down at her sneakers. James studied her for a moment, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out his pruning knife. Flipping it open, he pointed to the nearest apple tree, where a large withered branch was drooping toward the ground. You see that? He asked. Cassie blinked. Yeah. James walked over, placing a hand on the tree. This branch used to be strong, gave good fruit for a while. But storms came, and now it's dying. Cassie crossed her arms. So, James said, lifting the knife, do we leave it, hoping it'll get better? Or do we cut it loose before it drags the whole tree down with it? Cassie didn't answer, but she didn't need to. She already knew. James made the cut. The branch fell, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. Cassie swallowed hard, then turned and walked back toward the house. James watched her go, hoping she understood the lesson, hoping she knew that this time she got to decide which branches were worth keeping. The meeting. The diner was small, tucked into a quiet corner of town, the kind of place where nothing ever changed. The same coffee-stained menus, the same sun-faded curtains, the same waitress who had been working there since James was a kid. Cassie sat in the booth, her fingers clenched around a glass of water, her nails digging into the condensation. She hadn't taken a sip. James sat beside her, silent but steady. He hadn't forced her to come. The decision had been hers. She had chosen to be here. That was something. The door opened. A woman walked in, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Sarah Monroe. She was thinner than Cassie remembered. Her dark hair was pulled back, her clothes neat but plain. There were faint lines around her eyes, the kind that came from years of hard living. She looked normal. Not the monster Cassie had built in her head. Not the mother she used to imagine when she was little, waiting by the window for someone who never came back. Just a woman. Sarah's eyes landed on Cassie, and she hesitated, swallowing hard before stepping forward. "Cassie," she breathed. "God, you look so grown." Cassie stared at her, her body tense. She didn't speak. Sarah glanced at James, then slid into the booth across from them. She cleared her throat. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Cassie's voice was flat. "Neither was I." Sarah winced. "That's fair." The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The waitress stopped by, setting down a coffee for Sarah without asking, then disappearing again. Sarah wrapped her hands around the mug like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "I know I don't deserve this," she said finally. "I know I hurt you. More than once." Cassie's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. Sarah took a shaky breath. "I've been clean for 14 months. I've got a job. A place. I'm trying, Cassie." Her voice cracked. "I want to try." Cassie's hands tightened around her glass. Finally, she forced herself to meet her mother's gaze. "And what happens when you mess up again?" she asked, her voice sharp. Sarah flinched. She swallowed. "I don't know." Cassie clenched her jaw. "That's the problem." James sat silently beside her, his presence a quiet anchor. Sarah wiped at her eyes. I wanted to see you. I wanted to tell you that I love you." Cassie's breath caught. She had wanted to hear those words for so long. But now that they were here, they felt hollow. She looked down at her hands, her knuckles white. James didn't say anything. He didn't push her to respond. This was her choice. After what felt like forever, Cassie finally whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." Sarah sucked in a breath, blinking back tears. "I understand." Cassie stood abruptly, shoving her hands into her hoodie pocket. "I need to go." James nodded, standing up beside her. Sarah's voice was soft. "Cassie." Cassie hesitated. Sarah swallowed. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope, someday, you'll give me a chance." Cassie didn't answer. She turned and walked out of the diner. James followed. Roots take hold. The drive home was quiet. Cassie stared out the window, watching the town disappear behind them. When they reached the farmhouse, she got out of the truck and walked toward the orchard. James let her go. She needed time. An hour later, as the sky turned dark, he found her sitting under one of the older trees, knees pulled to her chest. He sat beside her, stretching out his legs, waiting. Finally, she said, "I don't know what I feel." James nodded. "That's okay." Cassie let out a shaky breath. "I thought I'd feel something. Angry. Sad. Something." James studied the trees in front of them, their branches shifting in the breeze. "You don't have to decide how you feel today." Cassie bit her lip. "You think I made the right choice." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you're learning that you get to make choices at all." Cassie sniffed. "That's a lot of responsibility." James smirked. "Yeah. Welcome to being alive." Cassie let out a soft laugh, wiping at her face. She leaned back against the tree, looking up at the sky. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to run. When the storm breaks, the orchard stretched out before Cassie, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between the rows of apple trees. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, the remnants of last week's storm still clinging to the landscape. But something had shifted. It wasn't the trees that had changed. It was her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about running. She wasn't mapping out the exits. She wasn't waiting for the next disaster to remind her that nothing ever lasted. She was just here. For now, that was enough. Aftermath. The house was quiet that night, the kind of silence that wasn't tense, just settled. James sat at the kitchen table, a pile of paperwork spread out in front of him. Cassie had seen him going through it for weeks now, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders tight with worry. He was trying to save the orchard. She didn't know why that mattered to her, but it did. Cassie hovered in the doorway, watching him. James finally looked up. "Something on your mind?" Cassie shrugged, shifting her weight. "The bank." James raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Cassie hesitated, then stepped inside, sliding into the chair across from him. "You're losing the farm, aren't you?" James sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I haven't lost it yet." Cassie crossed her arms. "But you might." James leaned back, studying her. "You worried about something, kid?" Cassie frowned. "It's just, you've been fighting for it. This place. And I." She swallowed hard. "I know what it's like to lose things. To have people just give up on you." James nodded slowly. Cassie clenched her fists. "If it happens, if the bank takes it, what are you gonna do?" James exhaled. "Not sure yet." Cassie's heart clenched. She had lived in 23 different houses, all of them temporary, all of them places where she had never unpacked her bag because she knew better. But this place, it didn't feel like just another stop, and she didn't want to lose it. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know, Cass, I never expected you to stick around." Cassie swallowed. "Yeah, me neither." James smirked. "So what now?" Cassie hesitated. Then, she said the words she hadn't even realized she meant. "We fight. One branch at a time." Cassie wasn't sure where the idea came from. Maybe it was the orchard, the way James had taught her that even broken trees could grow back if they were given the right care. Maybe it was the way she had watched him day after day, tending to the land with stubborn determination, even when it seemed hopeless. Or maybe it was just that, for the first time in her life, she wanted to fight for something real. She sat in the barn loft, an old notepad balanced on her knee, flipping through pages of scribbled ideas. "How much do you owe?" she asked one evening, catching James off guard. He frowned from where he was fixing a section of fence. "Why?" Cassie shrugged. "Just tell me." James sighed. "More than I'd like." Cassie chewed on the end of her pen. "How much money does the orchard make?" James raised an eyebrow. "Depends on the year. Last few seasons have been rough." Cassie tapped her fingers against the paper. "Have you ever tried selling more than just apples?" James gave her a look. "It's an apple farm, kid." Cassie rolled her eyes. "Yeah, but you could do more. Sell cider. Make a stand at the farmer's market. Do tours." James chuckled. "What, you got a business plan over there?" Cassie hesitated, then flipped the notepad around, revealing messy sketches of ideas. Things she had scrawled out in the last few days when she couldn't stop thinking about the farm. James looked at her, surprised. Cassie shifted uncomfortably. "I used to read about this kind of stuff. Back when I lived in group homes, I'd go to the library and check out business books. Not like it mattered, but James studied the notepad, then her. And then he did something she wasn't expecting. He nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's try it." Cassie blinked. "Wait, really?" James smirked. "You've been hacking up my trees for weeks. Might as well put that energy into something useful." Cassie snorted. "Gee, thanks." But her heart was racing. She had spent her entire life being told no, that she wasn't enough, that she was too much trouble. And now, for the first time, someone was listening to her. James pushed the notepad back toward her. "What do we do first?" Cassie grinned, and then together, they got to work. The harvest. The next few weeks passed in a blur of motion. Cassie worked alongside James, setting up roadside signs, helping with the cider press, arranging baskets of apples to sell in town. It was exhausting. It was frustrating. And she loved it. She had never belonged anywhere before. But now, as she sat at the farmer's market, counting the cash in the lockbox after a long day, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Pride. James leaned against the truck, stretching his back. "Not bad, kid." Cassie smirked. "Told you." James chuckled. Yeah. He nodded toward the lockbox. "You gonna do the math?" Cassie rolled her eyes but started counting. She was good with numbers. Always had been. She used to count down the days until she had to leave a home. Now she was counting something that actually mattered. James watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Cassie." She glanced up. "Yeah." James shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "The hearings in a few days." Cassie's stomach tightened. She nodded. "I know." James hesitated. "You ready?" Cassie wasn't sure what ready even felt like. But she looked at the lockbox in front of her, at the stack of receipts, at the orchard in the distance, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the answer. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I am." James exhaled, nodding. They sat there in the back of the truck as the sun dipped low over the horizon, the orchard glowing gold in the fading light. Cassie leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the moment sink in. She had spent her whole life waiting for people to send her away. But this time, she was choosing to stay. And for the first time, she knew she had something worth fighting for.